The tank class has been confirmed to be the topic of the upcoming Ashes of Creation January livestream. To me, of any class in an MMO, the tank class is the most important one to get right. The good thing for Intrepid, the Holy Trinity is a tried and true feature of most MMOs, and there are countless good tank examples from previous MMOs that they can borrow from, especially for PvE tanking. Intrepid does not have to reinvent the wheel here, in my opinion, but some small tweaks or innovations would be nice to make the tank class feel unique in Ashes of Creation. What we have seen of the tank in Ashes of Creation Alpha 1 was a pretty standard tanking toolkit. The only real interesting thing we saw was a ranged taunt, which is something I think is nice to see and could be very useful in PvP. I would also like to see a little better presentation of the class compared to the Cleric and Ranger showcases last year. While I did like both of these showcases, I would like to see a few more skills to get a better feel for the class, and better explanations of the skills before showing them. Maybe show the tooltip and then a quick explanation of how it works. With that out of the way, let's talk about a few specific things I would like to see regarding PvE tanking in Ashes of Creation. I would love to see some details about the threat system. We know Ashes is using a fairly standard threat system, but what I would love to know is how easy or hard it will be for a tank to maintain aggro. In most modern MMOs, it has become extremely easy for a tank to hold threat. In my opinion, it is too easy. Now, I don't want it to be incredibly hard for the tank to hold threat either, but having to at least pay attention to threat to some extent does add a natural dynamic to increase the challenge in PvE. I would also like to see some different ways for a tank to maintain threat other than just hitting taunt skills on cooldown or maximizing their DPS rotation. Maybe there could be windows where a boss is weak to a certain damage type, say bleeding, and the tank can apply bleeds during these windows and get a lot of threat built up that way. Or maybe there are some phases where taunt skills do not work at all and players really have to watch their threat. Or maybe DPS players have cooldowns that can drop their threat and or give their threat to the tank instead. And probably in some rare cases, maybe some threat table resets, or maybe a few encounters where a DPS has to maintain the highest threat in order for a boss to attack the tank. Just some things to occasionally change up the threat system so there is some variety. And to continue with that, I'm curious if Intrepid will give some in-game tells if someone is beginning to pull too much threat. There is not add-on support in Ashes, so having a threat add-on that clearly shows where you stand in terms of threat is not an option. But having maybe some visual or audio clues might be an interesting alternative to that. Somewhat related to this, I would love to see a return to CCing actually mattering in PvE. Make the encounters challenging enough that proper CCing is needed to complete the content, at least until players achieve a high enough gear score to outlevel the content. To add to that, I certainly don't want to see groups running into a dungeon, mass pulling, and AoEing everything down. To me, that is not compelling gameplay. I would also like to see multiple weapon builds be viable for tanking. We know that Sword and Shield will certainly be viable, but it would be nice to see other weapon sets that can adequately tank. They have stated that to be the case in the past, but that is an older quote at this point. It would be nice to see it in game. And it would be nice to see more about the active blocking. It would be nice to see Intrepid commit to whether or not stamina drain will be a part of active blocking or not. I tend to think it should, but hopefully we find out Intrepid's stance this month. In a lot of MMOs, there is a shortage of tanks. I would love to see some of what Intrepid has in mind to address this shortage. We do know that the group size in Ashes of Creation is 8 players, so if encounters are designed for 8-man groups, that will absolutely help with the tank shortage, as the DPS to tank ratio is higher than most MMOs. I would also like to see, even in raids, for only one tank to be required, with maybe some encounters needing off tanks. This again helps with the tank shortage. We know that the tank primary archetype is the only class that can be the main tank in groups. I would like to see those primary archetypes that choose tank as their secondary be able to fill that off-tank role as well. I hope that is the case, and I also hope that they don't have that many encounters that require off-tanks. Another issue with tanks in MMOs is leveling. Tanks typically have very low damage, so leveling solo is very difficult. In some MMOs, tanks can farm dungeons to level, but we don't know how viable that will be in Ashes. And quickly changing specs is not an option for tanks in Ashes. The only way to change specs is at a village stage node or higher. So in theory, a tank could switch between DPS and tank specs as needed, but with the size of the world, that might not always be viable. So one solution I thought of is a buff that increases the damage of a tank spec when they're solo PvEing. Not in PvP or when the tank is in a group. and to get around groups trying to remove the tank from the party to boost his damage, make it so the tank can hold aggro from the other players very well without being in their party, or make it so the tank can't receive heals when they have the damage buff active for being solo. This would alleviate one of the potential pain points for tanks and hopefully increase the tank population. So those are all my thoughts on ways to make PvE tanks more interesting while still fitting in a standard tanking model we have seen work in MMOs time and time again. But what about PvP? Well, the consensus of the MMO community seems to be that tanks are often bad or useless in PvP. To that I say that might be the case in a lot of MMOs, certainly the most popular ones like WoW, but there have been a few MMOs that bucked that trend in a very big way that Ashes can borrow from. To me, the MMO that did PvP tanking the best, without question, was Warhammer Online. In Warhammer Online, there were several skills that made tanks function extremely well in PvP. The first skill that all tanks had was called Guard. A tank can place this on an ally, and the damage that the ally takes is split with the tank as long as the tank remains within 30 feet of this ally. This was a great support skill and could allow a melee DPS to engage in a fight when otherwise it would not be possible. The next key ability that all tanks possessed was called Hold the Line. This skill would increase the tank's dodge chance by 45%. More importantly, it also provides a 15% chance to dodge for allies behind the tank and within 50 feet. This 15% could stack 3 times as long as the ally remained positioned in range of the tank and the tank kept channeling the ability. This is a great positional way that a tank can provide protection for their team. And interestingly, it seems somewhat similar to what Steven hinted at in the October livestream for a new tank skill that they are working on. I imagine this skill could potentially be a modernized version of Hold the Line from Warhammer Online. Or it could be similar to the Guild Wars 2 Guardian skill Wall of Reflection, which was simply a wall that the player could cast and all projectiles that hit the wall get reflected back to the caster. So the first thing I think a tank needs in PvP is to be someone that can provide dynamic group-wide shielding, whether through the dodge stat like in Warhammer Online or through an active wall that is positioned to reflect projectiles like in Guild Wars 2. After that, tanks should be disruptors. They should have access to a lot of CC. They should have the ability to apply annoying debuffs like a healing reduction. They should be able to remove buffs from enemies. And again, Warhammer Online had this in spades. If you look at the Return of Reckoning career builder page and start scrolling through the skills, you see a ton of CCs and interrupts for the tanks. You also see a skill that essentially kicks enemies away. This kick could send someone a long ways away and put that player into the heart of your team so they would very likely die. However, a tank would have to get within melee range of enemies and get in the correct directional position to pull this off. This allows for counterplay by the opponent. A lot of MMOs use a pull type of ability to pull enemies closer to you. This is something we saw in the Alpha 1 tank with the Javelin skill. I would like to see a combination of the two for the tank. A Javelin pull but have a shorter range than the kick. Then the kick skill potentially has a huge range if the tank has enough mana or energy, but the trade-off is the tank has to be in the thick of things to get within melee range and be positioned correctly. Further expanding upon the role of tanks in PvP is the idea of taunts. Again, Warhammer Online did this well. There are 2 main taunts that tanks had. The first one was simply called Taunt and would increase the damage that target took from the tank by 30% for 15 seconds or until the target attacked the tank 3 times. This allowed for smart counterplay and gave the taunt a viable use in PvP. The next taunt was called Challenge. This was an AoE taunt that would cause opponents to do 70% of their normal damage to everyone except the tank, and again it lasted for 15 seconds or until the enemies hit you 3 times. This again forces the enemy to attack the tank or deal reduced damage for a significant amount of time. I have also seen other games use a taunt as a simple CC where it forces the enemy to do basic attacks to the tank for a few seconds. This might also be a third type of taunt the tank could have in PvP. Also in Warhammer Online we saw body blocking as player collision was a thing. This is also something that Ashes of Creation is planning to have, and while I think player collision can cause problems in nodes and should be turned off there, in PvP it opens up a lot of potential for interesting gameplay. Tanks physically blocking choke points or surrounding and singling out an enemy target are possible. On top of body blocking and ashes, we are also going to have projectile collision. This means tanks have a role in the fight as the frontline defender, shielding their ranged DPS and healers from projectiles. So those are the lessons we can take from Warhammer Online on PvP tanking. What are some other ideas? Well, one thought I have is an aura type of ability that buffs allies. Perhaps the best example of this I have seen is from a game that no longer exists called Forge. In that game, the tank class had an ability called Vengeance that would give vengeance stacks based on the amount of enemies that are within melee range. So the more enemies around you, the faster you would gain stacks. So this encouraged the tank to be in the fight to get these stacks. With these vengeance stacks, the tank could activate one of two auras. Only one could be active at a time. One aura would increase allied movement speed and damage. The other would increase allied health and armor. These auras would be stronger the more stacks of vengeance the tank had. The auras did require upkeep as they would drain energy over time, so the tank would have to actively use builder skills to maintain enough energy to keep the aura active. And of course, allies would have to be in range of the aura to get the benefit of it. This is similar to the type of aura system I think would be great for Ashes of Creation. One change I would make is limiting how many vengeance stacks the tank could get. In Forge it was very high and could make the tank and allies unkillable if they got enough stacks. I would also allow some counterplay by the enemy team. The goal of a PvP tank is to be the target, but they are also very hard to kill. So what I would do is reduce vengeance stacks if the tank was taken below a health threshold. So you could remove half the stacks below 50% and 75% of the stacks below 25% health. This would allow some counterplay by the enemy team that does not require the tank to be completely killed. Further ideas I have for the PvP tank in Ashes of Creation is perhaps a damage buff that slowly builds the longer the tank is engaged in PvP combat and remains above a health threshold. It would stack to 5 stacks but reset to 0 stacks if the tank is taken below 50% health. This could be a further reason for the enemy team to want to attack the tank in PvP. Finally, for the tank, it would be nice to see the PvE and PvP builds work together. So if a tank has built specifically for PvE encounters, that build is also at least somewhat viable in PvP. With not being able to quickly change specs on the fly, I think having builds that work in a PvX manner is important. And for further ideas, Intrepid could look at MOBAs and games like Overwatch. Yes, they are in different genres, but they both were able to make PvP tanking work and could provide further ideas to expand upon. And that concludes my thoughts on what I would like to see for the tank in Ashes of Creation. We will get some idea of what the tank is this month, and I will do a breakdown of it just as I did for the Melee Showcase and the Ranger and Cleric Showcase. Thanks for watching, consider subscribing if you haven't, and I will see you in the next video.